haven't even mentioned it. When I was in undergrad, I was in a biology department instead of psych, but I also did a similar kind of a setup. It was called something different and it was geared towards biology students, but it was a co-op placement. So I got to work every other semester. So it worked out to probably about the same amount of experience, but it very quickly showed me what I did and did not enjoy about my field. So I was able to do, I did some animal rehab work. I worked with the federal government. I worked with the provincial government. I did a lot of like spreadsheet stuff, so some metrics, but it ended up being really interesting, and it got me eventually to, I worked with the government in between my undergrad and then my grad studies. So that's what I was doing, and why was because they had actually kept me on after a placement. So going into grad school, having some existing hands-on experience is usually pretty nice to have. But yeah, so as I said, it's kind of a nice transition to be able to talk today about actually conducting research and what kinds of research I've done, specifically how we can connect it to our topic that we just finished with operant conditioning in research. And so I've said this before, this section, I'm not intending for you to be learning anything new. We're just applying some of the terms you already got from the previous section, and I'm giving you sort of an application of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about research, but I'm not going to be testing you on black-capped chickadees or anything specific about this research. It might help to be discussing the terms in another context, but I'm not intending you to have to sort of study or memorize any of this. Hopefully it's just interesting. It's also very short, which is good. But at the beginning, you've heard me talk about black-capped chickadees quite a bit, but if you don't know anything about them as an animal, they are very small songbirds common to North America. There are a bunch of different species of chickadees. We focus on the black-capped chickadees, and they go from east to west coast. They go really far north and even very far south, so they have a pretty wide range. And there are even different subspecies that we can look at in between them. But what we care about with these guys and with other songbirds is that they're vocal learners. And what that means is they're not born knowing how to produce all of their species typical vocalizations. So when they're born, they have to learn how to sing and how to call just like humans do. So we're born and we have a predisposition to pick up our own languages, but we don't speak them naturally. We have to learn them. So chickadees and other songbirds are the same way. And that's how, when you're doing research, if you want to get funding, you usually have to creatively present your research in such a way that you can tie it to what we could learn about humans. So even if we just want to do basic research on chickadees, we might have to show how it could be applied to humans. So we typically take the stance of, well, another species of vocal learners. If we can understand how vocal learning evolved and how it works in another model species, maybe we can make some applications to vocal learning in humans. And when it comes to vocal learners, it's actually a fairly rare trait, though the more time that goes on, the more species we're finding that are capable of it. So it used to be sort of songbirds and parrots and humans, and now we've figured out that hummingbirds are able to do this, elephants, whales and dolphins, and seals, actually, I think were the most recent group that they found. So there's a couple of more groups that are able to do this, and they seem to be spread pretty far throughout like our evolutionary tree. So that gives us even more sort of motivation to see if we can find out the evolutionary roots of this kind of learning. But yeah, so that's our driving force, and that's the spin that we put on it when we're trying to apply for grants and things like that. All right. So in terms of what kinds of research questions do we typically ask, I'm going to talk mostly about stuff that I've worked on or that has been run in the lab while I was there, because we were a very communal group. If anyone was running a study, we were all helping. So that was beneficial, but also busy. But we looked at things like, can chickadees tell if vocalizations are produced by males or females? Can they sort of recognize them and react differently to different sexes? We looked at, do they treat predator calls and the mobbing calls that chickadees produce when they see those predators as the same? So when chickadees are faced with a predator, they will make an alarm call, and they're intending to get a mob of other birds to come help them fight it off. But their calls differ in structure based on the size and therefore threat level of the predator. So a smaller predator, like a saw-whet owl, is actually more dangerous to them because they're highly maneuverable. And when you're that small, a chickadee is a reasonable meal. But if we look at like a great horned owl, they really don't care about chickadees and probably couldn't catch one if they tried. So we see differences in the vocalizations they produce when they see one of these. But we also then compared their responses to not just the vocalizations of those owls, but to the sort of alarm calls produced from other chickadees that saw those owls. So we used mounts to make those vocalizations, and then the birds actually treated them very similarly. So we could see similar levels of arousal, so they got worked up for the small predators, but also for the reaction to small predators, and less so to the larger predators, which is very cool. And then the most recent thing I was working on was looking into anthropogenic noise. So does it interfere with their behavior? Does it interfere with their ability to discriminate between sounds? How does it affect them? And so what you might notice from all of these very wide variety of questions is they seem to be set up in a very similar way. And most of the time we're asking, can they tell the difference, or do they treat them similarly? And so that might make you start thinking about things like generalization and discrimination. And that's exactly what we're set up to look at in our lab. When we're doing operant conditioning, we're judging what they generalize between and what they discriminate between. And the point of that is basically, are they forming mental categories? So we can't directly ask the chickadee, play a sound, is this a male or is it a female? They can't answer that. So we need to set up a contingency where their behavior will only work if they can tell the difference. So we operate on this idea of categories or conceptual constructs, and then we can see how their behavior matches what we think they're doing. And so I'm going to walk through some explanations of this, but we're going to stick with our difference between male and female calls. So the idea here is, okay, if the chickadees form a conceptual category where male calls are grouped together and female calls are grouped together, then we would sort of theorize that any male call would be treated similarly to the other male calls. So they would generalize between all of those same type of calls. But they would then treat male calls differently from female calls because that's a separate category. So if we see those differences in behavior between those two categories, then we can say that the birds are probably forming some kind of mental conceptualization of two distinct categories. And we have to be really careful with wording. We can't say that they're thinking about them differently or anything like that. That is a very quick way to get angry reviewers in papers. But we can say that they're forming sort of mental conceptions of them. And that's fine. And then if they treat all of them the same, then maybe they only form one big category that puts all vocalizations together, and they don't bother separating them based on sex. And we can set this up for kind of any question that we want to ask. It works best with twos because it's a lot simpler to visualize with twos. So can you tell the difference between two categories? And that's usually what we focus on. So we've separated out our two categories, male versus female, and then we use a process called differential reinforcement. And we've already hinted that the whole differential concept is going to mean when we're telling the difference between things. So differential reinforcement would just mean that those two categories have different reinforcement contingencies. So for one, let's say our male vocalizations, those would receive positive reinforcement. So we give them access to food. So if they hear a male vocalization, they get food. If they hear a female vocalization, that's a different category, so it's going to have a different reaction. So this would be an unrewarded category or a non-reinforced category. And what we do is we turn the lights out for a few seconds just so that they have to wait to start a new trial. So it can count as punishment just because we're sort of reducing the likelihood that they'll do that behavior again. So by doing this, we effectively treat them that one category is good and one category is bad because one gets them food and one does not. Okay, and so the logic behind this is that if the categories that we've created, these things that we've constructed ourselves, male versus female, actually matches some kind of conceptual category that the chickadees have, and specifically that they use, then we have some assumptions about their behavior. The first assumption is that they should learn the discrimination, or they should learn to react differently to those two categories a lot faster than birds who can't rely on categories. So we set this up specifically by using a control group. So if you think we have one group where they get food when they hear male calls and they get nothing when they hear female calls, they can rely on categories. If we then took a random selection, some male calls and some female calls will get you food, and some male calls and some female calls that don't overlap will not get you food, well then those birds can't use a category. They can't just say respond to male calls. So they would instead have to memorize each call. This sound by this bird means I get food, but this other sound by a different bird means I don't. So that memorization should take a lot more time and effort. So if we have our two groups and we can compare between a true category group, where the category matches something conceptual, and then we have what's called a pseudo category or a control group, they would have to memorize. So we would say, well, if they're using categories, it should be a lot faster than memorizing. So we should see much faster rates of learning or much faster acquisition of a discrimination in the group that gets to rely on the categories. So it's a lot easier to learn that all male calls are good than to sort of focus in and memorize each individual call. I will say here that these guys are annoyingly good at memorizing individual vocalizations. From someone who has had to run many follow-up experiments with double or even triple the number of vocalizations to try and trick them, sometimes they can memorize up to like 300 or 400 vocalizations at a time. And they do it very quickly, which is annoying. So we have to use very large sample sizes to get at those differences. But that's one of those things that you learn as you do research where, okay, we thought that this would be the best way to do it, but maybe we should have a backup as well. And for that reason, we actually have a second thing that we look for to tell if they're using categories. And this is, we train them using a particular set of stimuli. So we'll use, say, 200 or 300 vocalizations produced by a certain set of birds, and we'll use that to train them. So that's when they learn that male calls are good and female calls are bad. And then once they've learned that, then we expose them to new vocalizations, stuff they haven't heard before, produced by different males and females. And we say, okay, well, if you are memorizing, the new vocalizations don't have any meaning to them. But if you are forming categories, then new male calls should be treated the same as old male calls. You should generalize your responding based on what you already learned. And so we can tell, based on how they treat new or novel stimuli that they haven't been exposed to before, if they're using categories or not. And I can absolutely say that having that backup has saved my butt a couple of times, because sometimes they memorize a whole lot faster than we would like, and we don't see any differences in performance at acquisition. So they learn at the same rate, but one of them is able to transfer their knowledge to new vocalizations, and the control group is not. So we're still able to say that they use those categories, but they memorized very, very quickly. All right. So I've also kind of held off on talking about what I mean by responding here, which, if we're talking about operant conditioning, is a really important aspect. Responding is half the battle here. So, what do I actually mean by responding? And when we have these operant setups, we've talked about a bunch of different options. We've kind of kept it fairly vague because they tend to be set up depending on your research. But I'm going to talk about the ones that I've seen most often. So there are typically two ways that you can set it up, especially if you're trying to ask a question like this. When we learn about operant conditioning, we mostly talk about, okay, when you see this stimulus, you do this response and you get that outcome, and that's it. But when I'm talking about having two different stimuli that should produce two different responses and get two different outcomes, we're looking at sort of not one process at once, we're looking at two parallel processes. They're learning two separate things. And so we can actually check what they've learned by presenting these two concepts together. The easiest way to do this is using a forced choice setup. And it's a lot easier to visualize this using visual stimuli. Auditory stuff gets a little bit funky. But with a visual stimulus, all right, you have blue or purple. One of them is going to get you food, and one of them is not. So you have a pigeon in a box, and two lights show up on a touch screen. One is blue and one is purple, and you ask them to peck one. So if they peck the purple one, they get food. If they peck the blue one, the screen turns off. So that would tell them that they should peck the purple one more, and they should peck the blue one less. And of course, you would want to sort of shift it so that they don't learn something else, like peck the left or the right, because they will learn that as well. But you can show them any kind of visual stimulus and teach them that this one is reinforced and that is not, and you can watch them learn how to tell the difference. A little bit of an aside, there's lots of literature. If you're interested, you can look up Bob Cook. He does research with pigeons, and they can tell the difference between cancerous versus non-cancerous cells. They can tell the difference between different artists, and they can classify them based on being impressionists or I can't remember what the other category was, but they can sort of generalize to other types of artists that are similar to what they were trained on. Basically, you can train pigeons to discriminate a lot of things. And he does a bunch of fun research on it. If you ever get the chance to see a talk by him, I highly recommend it. When I met him, he had a cast and was on crutches because he injured himself playing ultimate frisbee. And for someone in his 60s or 70s at the time, I was like, okay, very interesting person. But same kind of research, just with pigeons. So that's our forced choice option. And as I mentioned before I went off on my tangent, that's good enough for visual stimuli. But auditory sounds, that's a lot harder. You can't really present two sounds at once and expect them to make really fine distinctions between them. So you could theoretically play one and then the other, but then you run into the issue of order effects. And honestly, with chickadees, it's hard enough to make them sit through one stimulus, let alone two. So we use a different option, and that's what's called a go, no-go setup. And so in this case, instead of giving them two and asking them to choose, we give them one at a time. And we ask them to either make a response or withhold a response, to go or not go. And so here we have purple is still our good. Purple would get you food and blue does not. So when the purple comes up, you should peck it. When the blue comes up, you should not peck it. So that helps us with our auditory things because we can play a song or a call and say, is this the good category or not? Will you respond or not? And so that's pecking. You can also do pushing a button, pushing two different levers. With a lot of the pecking stuff now, they do touch screens, which makes it a lot more interesting. But we don't do any of that because chickadees are really bad at pecking. And instead, we rely on the fact that they are highly food motivated and they like to hop around a lot. So this is a cartoon of what the inside of one of our operant boxes looks like. So this is a Skinner box set up for chickadees. And so we have on the side here, this sort of black mesh covering is over a speaker. So that allows us to play our sounds to them from a very predicted location. That weird contraption in the middle, that's our feeder apparatus. So you can see there's a red dot. That's our cue light that tells them when a trial is ready. We then have receptors inside the feeder, so the feeder knows if the bird is in the feeder or not. And then in the middle, we have a food cup, so just a little plastic cup that when they make a response will rise up for them. So that's how they receive reinforcement. And so where the chickadee is sitting is on the request perch. So we need to make sure that they are paying attention and that they're in the right position to hear the sound. So what happens is a chickadee will stand on that perch. It breaks an infrared beam that tells the computer, I'm in place. The computer will pull a song or call randomly from our categories. So it might pull a male song or call, female song or call, and then it'll play it over the speaker. And once it's played, the chickadee gets to decide, are they going to make a response or are they going to withhold a response? If they make a response, they hop in the feeder. If they withhold a response, they go literally anywhere else. Hit my own mic here. And so if they hear a male call, is what we said were the good ones. If they hear a male call and they hop in the feeder, they get food. Food cup rises, they get to have food. If they hear a female call and they hop in the feeder, the lights turn out and then they start over again. If they hear a female call and correctly decide not to go in the feeder, then they'll hop somewhere else in the cage and they can come back to that perch and request a new trial right away. So it lets them start again really, really quickly. And so this whole setup, this is fairly complex behavior for a chickadee. And I'm actually going to show you a video in just a second here of what they do in the boxes. And you'll see that they hop constantly. They have perches and they hang upside down and they move all the time. So how do we actually get them to sit on a request perch? How do we teach them what to do in order to respond? And you might have figured out the answer would be shaping. So exactly like what we talked about in class, we have to go through all of these processes to teach the chickadees exactly what behavior it is that we're looking for. So on day one, when we bring them into these Skinner boxes, these operant boxes, we give them some time to acclimatize to the situation. I think I mentioned before, chickadees don't like being handled. They're not like pigeons who you can just sort of bring wherever, whenever. Chickadees you handle as little as possible and then you leave them to their own devices so they're happy. So we bring them into the boxes. They're really angry for a day or so. And it's nice soundproofed so that they're not going to be spooked by anything. And when they're put in, the food cup is up in the feeder. And there's a pile of food on top. We also put an extra cup of food in there in the same place that it is in their home cage. So when they're in the big colony rooms, everything's set up the same way. And so this teaches them that if they go in the feeder, there's food there. And so we wait a little while, we make sure that they've actually been in the feeder a lot. And after a couple of days, we'll sort of change it so that now, whenever the bird hops into the feeder, the food cup will rise to give them food. So they learn that they have to go in the feeder, and then it will rise to give them their food. Then we introduce our cue light, where the feeder doesn't rise every single time. Now it will only rise if the light is on. So if the red light is on and they hop in the feeder, then it'll rise, they get food. If the red light is off and they hop in the feeder, nothing happens. So that's our discriminative stimulus that tells them what's going to happen with their behavior. And so eventually they figure that out. They hop in the feeder when the light is on, they don't when it's off. And then we'd have to teach them that the request perch is involved in this process. So now they have to sit on the request perch to turn the red light on to get the feeder to rise. So we're adding an extra step there. So whenever they land on that perch, the light turns on, and then when they hop in the feeder, the food cup rises. And at first, as I said, chickadees hop a lot. So they're just going to touch that perch and keep going. And at the beginning, we only get them to touch the perch. Then we get them to sit on the perch. And then we get them to sit for longer on the perch. So we slowly get them to the point where they will sit on the perch long enough to hear a full vocalization. So sometimes it takes some extra work. Sometimes they're not super bright and they will spend like weeks on this stage. But eventually we get them to the point where they learn that if they stay there for the full duration of a sound, then they can make a response and either get food or not. So we shape their behavior from knowing absolutely nothing about the apparatus to being experts at it. And in fact, when we get them doing these discrimination tasks, they can have, I have seen up to 100% performance. They tend not to sit still long enough to always be 100% accurate, but 90% is usually what we see. So they do a really good job, and they do an even better job with their own vocalizations. So like I said, I'm actually going to show you a video. So if you imagine looking at this box from behind the feeder, so where the cue light is looking into the feeder, and a downward would be where the food rises, and then you're looking into the rest of the box, that's where the camera is for these videos. And I'm going to do it outside of the PowerPoint thing because we don't need the first minute and a half of this. And of course, I can never get the sound to work properly, so I will describe what's going on. But we're going to start with a correct response by flying into the feeder. So you're going to see a chickadee. They're going to land on the request perch. They're going to sit still for a while. That's when a call is going to play. So from our example, it would be a male call. Then they hop in the feeder and the food cup rises. So that's what we're going to start with. You can see he moves very quickly, lands on his perch, sits for a moment, hops in the feeder, and gets his food. And then he immediately shoves it in his water dish, because that's what they do, is they cache. So next is correctly not responding when he hears a female call. So he's going to sit on the perch for a second, listen, and then go somewhere else. So that was the correct response. But what happens when they go in the feeder when they hear that female call? So we'll see here. He's going to sit, he's going to listen, he's going to hop right in the feeder, and the light turns out. So those are our three options there. And we can record the rates at which each of those occur to figure out, okay, are they going to all the male calls? Are they no going to all the female calls? And how quickly did they learn to tell the difference? So we can look at their rates of responding. We can have lots of neat graphs showing their response rates. And then we can check how do they compare to our control groups, so the groups that had to memorize. And so I can say that having done an experiment like this, looking at male versus female calls, and having run it 3 separate times, because the first time I had to add more vocalizations. The second time we had to look at only parts of the vocalizations. So we had to do a couple of iterations of this. And we've learned that chickadees can tell the difference between males and females and choose not to, because with our calls, they are typically functional vocalizations. They use them for sort of allying with their flock members, for dealing with predators, those sorts of things. If we look at some of their songs, which are used for mating, then they care, and they form categories, and they have really nice discriminations, and everything looks great. But as soon as we get into things that are not sex-related, they no longer care and no longer form categories. So it took me 4 years to figure out that they do the opposite with one type of vocalization versus what they do with another type. So I got to find the joys of publishing pretty much null results, but it was kind of neat to learn at the end, especially where it goes against literally everything else that they do. But just another one of those sort of cautionary tales of some of the things that you figure out with research. All right, and so that's what I wanted to go over today. As I said, we're reviewing a lot of concepts and terms in a practical sense, but also very short. And since we are done early, I figured I'd hang around, see if you have any questions for the exam, or anything you want to go over before then. But otherwise, you are free to go for the weekend. And then I get to see you on Monday.